Because I'm not the man you can call and devise a plan to convince a woman to end a life that you created. This is Bedtime Stories, Grown-Up Edition. Short story, The Perfect Storm, Part 3. I am back home missing my sister. When we left off, Saint, Art, and Tori had come to a comfortable, silent agreement. He'd been a finisher for the five families for a little less than 2 years, a job he'd taken when his father Nigel was still alive. In that short time, he'd mastered the art of being incognito, keeping his cards close to the vest, and keeping the people closest to him in the world out of the know. His brother Sincere had only recently learned that he was even in the life, and Sincere was even newer to it than he was. His introduction to being a kingpin hopeful only occurred after his father Nigel's death. Sincere had a whole lot of work to do in order to secure his spot. And while he was absolutely able to reap the benefits of being the oldest son of the kingpin and a contender for his seat, his younger brother Saint was instrumental in his learning process. They'd already completed 5 of 7 missions intended to provide Sincere with on-the-job training, as well as tying up loose ends that their father's death had left blowing in the wind. Nigel was a documented philanderer, so their mother wasn't his only mistress. As a matter of fact, he had her put up in Miami, but they hadn't been romantically involved in decades. In her place, he had 7 mistresses around the world, women who were well aware that Nigel was a married man, and not knowing how much those women knew about the St. James organization, the 5 families, or about Nigel's wife, Catherine. Catherine had assigned Sincere and Saint to take every last one of them out. Thus far, they'd taken out 5. The last 2 were in Paris and Japan. And that's what they were doing before Sincere got called to Puerto Rico. The initial plan was for Sincere to go to Puerto Rico and find out why he'd been summoned by Big Nate. And then he and Saint would return to Paris and continue their 6th assignment. But the plan had changed. Great. Sincere was under the impression that he needed to head to Miami in order to make arrangements for Natalia and her mother, Miss Eugenia, to relocate to the St. James estate there. But when he left that meeting with Big Nate and Emmanuel Lopez, he had a whole new assignment. He needed to end things with Amber in New York and Janelle in Miami, and then prepare for Natalia and Miss Eugenia's arrival. He also needed to get an update on his sister Chantal's kidnapping, and he assumed that that was the reason why Saint would be meeting him in Miami. But Catherine hadn't been known as the mastermind and the brains behind the operation for nothing. She knew a whole lot more about what was going on in the lives of her stepchildren than they realized. She'd made it her business to know what was going on in their lives. All of their lives. While nobody in her world had a clue that they existed before their father's death, she was always in the know. And not because her husband had told her. So not only did she know all that there was to know about Amber and Janelle and what was going on with Sincere and Natalia, but she also knew what was going on in Saint's love life, despite the fact that he hadn't told her a thing. In the same way that she'd perfected knowing everything about everything, she'd also perfected minding her business. She and Saint was still learning how to navigate one another. It had been easy for her to establish a relationship with Sincere and Simone, but Saint and Star still were holding on to their loyalty to their biological mother, despite knowing the type of woman she really was. And Chantal was distant with everybody, so there was no surprise that Catherine was still working on her. So she knew that it wasn't in her best interest to try to put a bug in Saint's ear about his love interest, so she decided instead to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. She needed to tell Saint that Simone had been kidnapped, and so had his baby sister, Star. When Saint left New York, headed to Miami, he and Tori had 3 fun-filled days, and he felt real good about continuing to get to know her. Neither of them had put all of their cards on the table, but they both left the trip with a comfortable understanding. And when he got to the St. James estate in Miami, Catherine was waiting for him, and he could tell from the look on her face that whatever it was that she wanted to discuss with him that required him to fly to Miami was going to piss him off. And when she finished explaining that Simone had been kidnapped several weeks before, Saint said, "And why is this the first time that I'm hearing about it? I've been in New York, gallivanting with a broad. I could have been looking for my sister." Catherine said, "Be easy. I know exactly where your sister is. I put 2 covert operatives on it. One of them is with Simone right now. We orchestrated a plan that resulted in her being kidnapped as well." Saint said, "Your covert operative got kidnapped?" Catherine said, "That was the plan. She got kidnapped while the other covert operative watched. She had a tracker on her person that was wired for video and sound. We also had the second covert operative trail her, just in case that tracker was found and disposed of." Saint said, "What are you not telling me?" Catherine said, "That covert operative posed as your sister Chantal. In the criminal world, you and your sister Star do not exist." Saint said, "You turned my baby sister into a covert? Catherine said, and she's one of the best to ever do it. Saint said, you are out of your damn mind. If anything happens to my sisters, Catherine said, I'll turn this whole city red. Why you don't get that I actually care about all 5 of you, and I'll move heaven and earth to protect you all. Both of your sisters are actually fine. Unfortunately, though, the kidnappers did take advantage of the fact that Simone is a recovering addict. They thought that they would be able to get information from her if they plied her with drugs. The only reason why I sent Star in is because we'd been waiting for them to make contact, make a demand, and they hadn't. It seems that even heavily drugged, your sister was one way. She ain't give nothing up. So they didn't have a way to get in contact with Sincere. Now that they have Star, who they believe is Chantal, they have enough information about her life as a devout, apostolic Christian to cajole her into giving them Sincere's contact information. And she knows exactly how long to stall them out before she gives it up. Saint said, why you don't just go in after them? Why wait for them to make contact? Catherine said, because we need to know what they want. We need to know what the end goal is. We know everything there is to know about them. And when we strike, we are going to obliterate them. We just needed the advantage back in our court. And then it's game, set, match. Catherine loved tennis. Hearing the full plan, Saint was a lot calmer. But he still had questions. He asked, does Chantal know that Simone and Star have been kidnapped and that Star was pretending to be her? Catherine said no. I haven't told her. And I don't plan to. So don't do it. Saint asked, and why is this the first that I'm hearing about it? Catherine said, because I needed you focused. Your brother is a handful. I also needed to keep you off the traffickers' radar. If they don't know that you exist, why tell them? Saint said, you know that I know how to fly under the radar. Catherine said, I do, and I want to keep it that way. Saint said, I got more questions about how you managed to get Star in a position where she could assume Chantal's life. Catherine said, and the other covert can answer those questions for you. Then she looked at her right hand and gave him a nod. He walked out of the room and returned with the covert operative, Christine. Catherine said, Christine, this is Saint Montclair, my stepson and a finisher for the 5 families. Nigel had been downright diabolical. Annabelle never knew his last name. Well, eventually she found out, but when they were making babies, she thought his last name was Montclair because he was using his wife's maiden name. As a result, all 5 of his children were wearing his wife's last name. Now, Sincere, in his bid to assume his father's seat, had also assumed the St. James last name. He'd taken to introducing himself as Sincere St. James. All 3 of his daughters had decided to retain the last name Montclair in order to avoid being connected to the St. James criminal organization. And Saint had chosen to retain the last name Montclair in order to continue his anonymity, both in the life and in the business world. All of his business dealings were done under his middle name and the last name Montclair, making it very difficult for anyone who might discover that he was in fact a St. James to connect all those dots. So after introductions were concluded and Saint had asked all of his questions, the covert operative, who was extremely bold, said, now that we've gotten all of the business out of the way, are you single, Saint? And Saint said, I am, but I'm not available. And Christine said, understood. And then she looked at Catherine and said, I need to go and have a conversation with my mother. And then she sashayed out of the room. When she was gone, Saint asked, her mother is here too? Catherine said yes. Christine isn't just a covert operative. Her family is connected, and they've been dragged into this whole fiasco with the International Trafficking Organization. So I've agreed to open our home to them. Talk to me. You looked like you saw a ghost when Christine walked in here. Saint said, nah, she just really resembles somebody I know. Catherine said, oh, really? And who might that be? Saint said, I'd rather not discuss it until I have more information. Catherine said, I have to caution you. Don't forget that the identities of covert operatives cannot, under any circumstances or for any reason, be revealed to anyone in their real lives. The only reason why I unveiled Star is because she's in the hands of some dangerous people, and I'm going to need your help and Star's to get Simone's life back on track. Hearing that, Saint had a suspicion that Catherine knew more about his personal life than he had chosen to reveal. He also realized that his hands were tied. He was going to have to be really strategic about the questions that he asked. So he asked Catherine, so other than Christine and her mother, is anybody else staying here? And Catherine, pretending like she didn't know what Saint was asking, said, as of right now, they're it. And Saint breathed a sigh of relief, because if Christine was who he thought she was, he was not going to be the only one with questions if Tori showed up in Miami, and he didn't know how true that was. Meanwhile, across town, Sincere was having a rather difficult discussion with Janelle. He said, Nell, what the hell are you thinking? She said, what you mean? I was thinking that you meant what you said when we was getting it in. Sincere said, you don't know pillow talk when you hear it? I can't count the number of women I told that they snatched was so good I wanted them to have my baby. But you the only one stupid enough to think I actually wanted you to get knocked up. You can't have this baby. I'm not ready. I came here to end things. Nell said, that's fine. We can end. But you still gonna take care of this baby. Sincere said, there shouldn't be a baby. Nell said, well, there is. What you want me to do? Sincere said, take a trip to the clinic. I'll pay for it. Nell said, you know, I'm not doing that. You should have thought about whether you wanted to have a baby with me before you ran up in this raw. Sincere said, that's why I told you to get on birth control. You shouldn't have stopped taking it just because a nigga said something in the heat of the moment. Your lifestyle can't even support you being somebody's damn mother. Nell said, well, yours can. From the looks of that Rolls Royce that your mama pulled up in, you got long money. Sincere said, this is not about money. And that's not my mother. That's my stepmother. Nell said, oh, that makes sense. No wonder you don't look nothing like her. Sincere said, focus, Nell. You still clubbing, fighting, and getting drunk. How you having a baby? Nell said, well, you know, God takes care of babies and fools. So he set it up so that the placenta don't actually attach to the lining of the uterus or whatever until after like the 10th week. So nothing that I done drunk could have any effect on the baby. But I stopped drinking last week. Sincere said, but you haven't stopped clubbing and fighting. Nell said, that don't matter. I know women who done fell down flights of stairs and they were still pregnant. Hell, my mother tried to beat a baby out my sister. And my niece still here. Your baby is good. Don't worry. Sincere said, I don't care if the baby is good. Get rid of it. Nell said, and if I don't? Sincere said, you playing with my life, my future. I got too many balls in the air for this, Nell. I'm trying to keep you safe on the strength of what we've shared over the years. But that season is over. You not gonna be my baby mama. If you want to live to be somebody else's, get rid of this baby. And then he walked out. And as soon as the door was closed, both Sincere and Nell made phone calls. Sincere called Q and Nell called Catherine. When Catherine had come to tell Nell what was up, she left her with her phone number. Catherine knew that Nell was gonna be a problem. And she wanted to make sure that Nell had a way of getting in contact with her instead of Sincere. She knew that Janelle was not going to go away easily, and she could also smell a pregnant woman a mile away. So when her phone rang and Janelle's name was on the call ID, she prayed for strength and said, how you doing, Janelle? And Janelle said, not so good. You need to have a conversation with your son. Then she told Catherine everything that had transpired. And Catherine said, and there's nothing that I can say that. Nell said, if he couldn't change my mind, you sure can. I figured that you would understand. Don't you got kids? Catherine said, if I did, I wouldn't have them with a man who didn't want them. Nell said, well, as far as I'm concerned, a man who doesn't want children should strap up. Catherine said, and I agree, which is why I'm going to talk to Sincere. You just make sure that you follow the instructions I gave you. And since you're pregnant, you shouldn't have any problem avoiding the bars, clubs, and fistfights. When Q answered Sincere's call, Sincere said, cuz, you busy? Q said, I'm sitting here looking at my brand new baby boys. Sincere said, oh yeah, that's right. Congratulations. But listen, can you talk? Q chuckled and said, what's up, cuz? Sincere said, I got a problem. I just ended things with Lil Miami, the broad I told you I've been kicking it with for some time. And Q said, okay, and how'd that go? Sincere said, not good. She talking about she pregnant, and it's mine. I don't know where she been. And Q said, let me stop you right there. You've been having sex with her? Sincere said, of course. Q said, then if she said it's your baby, it's your baby. Until Dana says otherwise. Sincere said, that's crazy as hell. Q said, no. What's crazy is you running up in a broad raw. Sincere said, I never said that. Q said, what's crazy is you running up in a broad raw and not expecting that one of two things would happen. Either she'd get knocked up or you'd get burnt. Sincere said, I'll take burnt for 200, Alex. Q just chuckled and said, you're going to be a father. It sounds like you need to get ready. And you need to figure out how you going to tell Natalia. Sincere said, I am not having a baby with that crazy broad. Q said, you don't get to tell a woman what to do with her body after you use it for your own pleasure. And if you aren't prepared to deal with the real life consequences of being sexually involved with women, and or you can't see yourself having children with those women, then you shouldn't be sexually involved with those women. Sincere said, that's crazy too. People have sex every day with people that they don't want to be with, that they don't want to have kids with. Q said, and they shouldn't. The world is full of illegitimate, unwanted individuals who suffer for their parents' foolishness and spend the rest of their lives trying to find their identity, a place in this cold world, and a safe place to land. You should know. And then Sincere was speechless. Q said, now if there's nothing else, I need to get back to my children. Because I'm not the man you can call and devise a plan to convince a woman to end a life that you created. When Sincere got back to Catherine's, the man was fit to be tied. He'd heard Q, but he hadn't heard Q. And when Catherine told him that Janelle had called her, he said, you gotta help me. I can't do this. And I damn sure can't tell Natalia that I got this girl knocked up, even if it happened before I met her. Catherine said, and what exactly do you want me to do, Sincere? Sincere said, you gonna make me tell you? Catherine said, absolutely. You want a trigger pulled? You gotta load the gun. And then Sincere said, pull the security and get rid of her. Catherine said, now imagine if your father had made that same decision when your mother got pregnant. And Sincere said, I'm not my father. And Catherine made the phone call. Over the next few days, Sincere was busy. Catherine had him leading Operation Trifecta, the operation to rescue Simone and Star and take down and take out the criminal organization responsible for their kidnappings. When Sincere had asked about the arrangements to have Natalia temporarily relocated to the St. James estate in Miami, Catherine said, everything is already lined up. She's already left Texas. Everything she needs has been shipped here, and she's spending some much-needed quality time with family. Sincere asked, she has family in Miami? I ain't know that. Catherine said, you focus on this job. And when it's wrapped up, the two of you will be reunited, and you'll have an opportunity to meet them. After the debrief at the round table, of course. I hope she won't be disappointed to discover that you're still on chapter 1 of Invisible Man. Sincere said, nah, I'm actually on chapter 4. We discussed chapter 2 when I got to Miami, and we've agreed to catch up when I see her. And Catherine said, smart man. Meanwhile, on South Beach, Natalia and her sister Courtney were on the private access side of the beach. They were staying in a private beach house where they'd been luxuriating for 2 days. They'd been enjoying the amenities that included a private chef, a masseuse, a jacuzzi, a pool, and beach access. And they'd also been discussing their respective love lives. Natalia had shared with her sister that she was in quite the conundrum. She'd been actively rotational dating, and it had been going swell. There were 2 fellas who were local, who had already been knocked out of the race. One fella in Puerto Rico, who couldn't really handle the distance. And Bruce had thrown so much salt in the game that any and everybody in Puerto Rico who even knew of Natalia thought she was downright dirty. And then there were the 2 remaining fellas. One was Sincere, and while they'd had a rocky start and he'd had a couple of hiccups, he was still going strong, and he had shown himself to be a contender for her heart. He was smart, he was funny, and for all he didn't know or do naturally, he was willing to learn, and he'd shown that he knew how to put what he learned into practice. Natalia had no clue who'd been in his ear, but something had changed after their conversation about Bruce when he was in Puerto Rico. And he'd even confessed that he'd still been involved with a woman in New York and one in Miami, but that he'd gone and met with both of those women in person and ended things with them for good. And she hadn't even asked him to do that. All she'd asked was that he abstain from being sexually intimate with anybody while they were getting to know one another and trying to figure out whether they could make something work. Her request was twofold. Not only did she not want drama between her and whoever he was sleeping with, but she didn't want his sexual involvement with one or more women to cloud his judgment or to negatively impact their relationship if they decided to be in one. She had enough experience to know that if they got serious, it was very well possible that things would have to come to a screeching halt if, when she asked to see his my chart, the results came back saying he needed an antibiotic. Or if, when he got ready to end things with whomever else he was involved with, one of them came back and said she was in the family way. She had no idea just how close she was to Sincere's current reality. Natalia knew that if either of those things happened, it would be a no-go for her, no matter how much she liked the man. And when Natalia and Courtney got to that part of the discussion, Courtney said, I think it's unreasonable to ask a man to abstain, especially if he wasn't already abstaining. That isn't something that you can do for another person. That has to be something that you're already doing for yourself. You have to value it independent of whoever you meet. Natalia said, I agree, which is the reason why I didn't cut him off when my intuition said he wasn't abstaining. And once we had the conversation, I never doubled back and asked him about it. Because he grown. He got to decide for himself. And I'm glad to know that he did. That bodes well for our future prospects. Over at the main house, Sincere and Saint were having a conversation with the men of the 5 families. They'd convened for the round table that would be held the following day, and as Catherine had promised, she'd arranged for Sincere to have a sit-down that included a history lesson and some real talk from the OGs. And she figured that Saint could benefit from being a part of that conversation. Manny, Idra, and Samuel, who was participating in the conversation remotely and was the retired head of the Baptiste family, had told Sincere and Saint everything there was to know about the Five family's history, about their grandfather and their father's role in it, about how it came to be that Nigel St. James had become the head of the St. James family and not his older brother, Quincy Anders St. James III, and the kind of man that Anders was. When they segued into their own lives, Sincere found it interesting that Idra had been the head of the Charles family without the benefit of a wife. And when Idra and Manny explained about how marriages were arranged back in the day, and Idra shared his lifelong love for the Queen Mother, despite the fact that her marriage had been arranged with Anders, Sincere realized that he wasn't going to get out of being somebody's husband before he was crowned. And when the topic of children came up, he finally got the backstory of how Manny ended up marrying Marisol, despite the fact that he'd had a brief relationship with Nadia, the sister of Idra. Manny shared how he didn't learn about the birth of his son Stanley until his son Stanley had turned snake, and he had to choose between him and the Five families. Sincere asked, wouldn't you have preferred, wouldn't it have been easier for everybody if Nadia would have just not kept the baby? Manny said, we don't do that. I couldn't have lived with that on my conscience, and neither could she. I couldn't have stood before God on Judgment Day and explained how I allowed a woman who was carrying life to end up in a situation where her back was against the wall and the only option she had was to terminate a pregnancy. Sincere said, I don't even understand. I'm in a room full of killers, and every time I talk to any of y'all talking about God. Manny said, gangsters aren't a monolith. We are who we are, and we are as successful as we are. Because despite all of our wrongdoings, we all know and love God. And it's easy for somebody on the outside looking in to question just how true that is. But my Lord and Savior was crucified on a cross between two criminals. And despite the fact that they were paying for their crimes, he looked over at one and told him that because of his belief, he would be with him on that day in paradise. I don't take God's grace for granted. I am well aware of the fact that one day I will pay for the crimes that I have committed against God. And everything that I've done is illegal, but it has not all been immoral. I don't do anything I can't live with. And I don't do anything that I'm not prepared to answer for. And despite all of my shortcomings, I value life. And then looking at Saint and Sincere, he said, and you two and your sisters are here right now because your father and your stepmother valued your lives.